The winter wind screamed across Red Canyon, carrying snow through the narrow valleys and covering the old trails in white. At the edge of the canyon stood a small wooden cabin, nearly hidden beneath tall pine trees. Inside lived Elias, a quiet Apache scout who had learned to survive with very little. Elias had no family nearby and no neighbors he could trust. His possessions could fit into a few wooden boxes, a rifle, a hunting knife, a worn blanket, some dried meat, and one precious horse named Thunder. Thunder was more than an animal to Elias. The strong brown horse had carried him through dangerous mountains, long hunts, and freezing nights. When Elias had lost the people he loved, Thunder had been the one constant presence in his life. One evening, while returning from a hunting trip, Elias noticed something unusual in the snow. At first, he thought it was the body of a deer. Then the figure moved. Elias immediately reached for his rifle. A wounded orc woman was lying beside the trail. Her clothing was torn, and dark blood covered her side. An arrow had pierced her near the ribs. She tried to lift herself but collapsed again. Elias stared at her. Humans and orcs had been enemies for generations. He had heard stories about orc warriors attacking settlements, and he knew orcs had their own stories about humans. Walking away would have been easy. But then the woman opened her eyes. "Please," she whispered. "Don't leave me." Elias lowered his rifle. He carefully approached her and examined the wound. She was losing too much blood. If he left her there, she would probably die before sunrise. Elias lifted her onto his back and carried her through the snow to his cabin. Inside, he placed her beside the fireplace and began treating the wound. He cleaned the injury, wrapped it with strips of cloth, and gave her the last of his dried meat. The orc woman watched him with confusion. "You're human," she whispered. Elias nodded. "You hate us." "I don't hate you," he answered. She looked surprised. By morning, her fever had grown worse. She was still too weak to stand. Then Elias heard something outside. Boom! 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 Distant drums echoed through the canyon. Elias stepped outside and looked toward the ridge. A large orc war party was approaching. His heart tightened. If they found their wounded companion inside his cabin, they might believe he had kidnapped her. Elias knew he wouldn't survive a confrontation with dozens of armed warriors. He looked at Thunder. Then he looked at the wounded woman. There was only one way to get her safely away. Elias saddled his horse. The woman immediately understood. "No," she whispered. "You need him." Elias shook his head. "I can walk." "You'll freeze." "Maybe." He helped her onto Thunder and placed the reins in her hands. "Ride north," he said. "Find your people." The woman stared at him, tears forming in her eyes. "Why would you give me your only horse?" Elias looked toward the approaching drums. "Because you're hurt." Thunder carried her into the snowy forest. Elias stood alone outside his cabin, watching his only companion disappear. He had just given away the most valuable thing he owned. But he didn't know that the woman he had saved was Princess Kayla, daughter of the orc chieftain. And the next morning, 70 armed orc warriors would arrive at his cabin, not to kill him, but to do something nobody could have imagined. The morning after Elias gave Thunder to the wounded orc woman, the canyon was strangely quiet. There were no birds singing near the cabin. No deer moved through the trees. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Elias stood outside with his rifle across his shoulder, staring at the trail where Thunder had disappeared. For the first time in many years, he felt completely alone. Thunder had been his only horse, his traveling companion, and the one creature he trusted without question. Without him, Elias couldn't travel far, hunt properly, or carry supplies. Still, Elias didn't regret his decision. He had saved a life. That was enough. Then he heard it. A low rumble echoed between the mountains. Elias froze. It wasn't thunder. It was hundreds of footsteps. He quickly grabbed his rifle and climbed onto the roof of his cabin. From the ridge, he saw movement between the trees. One figure became 10. 10 became 30. Then Elias counted more than 70. Orc warriors. They marched through the snow carrying spears, bows, shields, and axes. Elias's hand tightened around his rifle. He knew there was no way he could defeat 70 warriors alone. He climbed down from the roof and stood in front of his cabin. If they had come for revenge, he would not run. The warriors stopped about 20 yards away. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then their leader stepped forward. He was an enormous orc with gray hair, a scar across his cheek, and a heavy iron axe hanging from his belt. Elias raised his rifle. The orc leader raised one hand. Every warrior behind him immediately stopped. Then something unexpected happened. The leader lowered his weapon. And slowly, he dropped to one knee. Elias stared at him. One by one, the 70 warriors followed. Within moments, every orc warrior was kneeling in the snow. Elias couldn't understand what he was seeing. The orc leader looked directly at him. "Human," he said, his deep voice echoing through the canyon, "we came to find the one who saved our princess." Elias lowered his rifle slightly. "Princess?" The leader nodded. "The woman you found yesterday was Kayla, daughter of our chieftain." Elias finally understood. The wounded woman hadn't been an ordinary traveler. She was royalty. The orc leader continued. "When Kayla returned to us riding your horse, she told us everything." He pointed toward the forest. "She told us you carried her through the snow. You treated her wounds. You gave her food when you had almost none." The leader paused. "And then you gave her your only horse." Elias looked away. "I didn't do anything special." A murmur moved through the warriors. The orc leader shook his head. "You don't understand." He stood and walked closer. "Our people have fought humans for generations. We have lost fathers, mothers, brothers, and children. We were taught that humans could never show us mercy." He placed his fist against his chest. "But you did." Then he opened his hand. "We came here to repay the debt." Behind him, several warriors brought forward supplies, sacks of grain, dried meat, blankets, medicine, tools, and a beautiful black horse. Elias stared at everything. "I don't want payment." The orc leader smiled faintly. "It isn't payment." He pointed toward the black horse. "It is friendship." Elias remained silent. Then a familiar sound came from the trees. A horse's footsteps. Elias turned. Thunder emerged from the forest. And riding on his back was Kayla. She was still weak, but she was alive. She dismounted slowly and walked toward Elias. "You saved my life," she said. Elias shook his head. "You would have done the same." Kayla smiled. "No. Not everyone would." She looked back at the 70 warriors. "That's why they came." Elias looked at the kneeling warriors and finally lowered his rifle. For the first time, he realized something had changed. He had given away his only horse. But somehow, he had gained 70 friends. Elias never expected to step inside an orc settlement alive. Yet by sunset, he was riding beside Princess Kayla toward the heart of the Red Canyon, surrounded by 70 warriors who had arrived at his cabin that morning. The black horse they had given him moved steadily beneath him. Thunder rode several lengths ahead, carrying Kayla. Every few minutes, she turned around to make sure Elias was still following. Elias couldn't help thinking about how strange the situation was. Only 2 days earlier, he had believed the orcs were enemies. Now their warriors were escorting him as if he were an honored guest. When they reached the settlement, Elias saw hundreds of orcs gathered around wooden homes built beneath the cliffs. Children stopped playing. Hunters lowered their bows. Elderly villagers stepped outside to see the human who had saved their princess. The reaction wasn't entirely friendly. Some orcs stared at Elias with suspicion. One old warrior spat into the snow. "A human has no place here." Elias heard him but said nothing. Kayla immediately stepped between them. "He saved my life." The old warrior narrowed his eyes. "And what does he want in return?" "Nothing," Kayla answered. That silenced the crowd. Elias looked around. "I didn't save her because I wanted anything." The orc chieftain finally appeared. He was older than Elias expected, with long gray hair and a deep scar running from his forehead to his jaw. He approached Elias slowly. "My daughter says you gave her your only horse." Elias nodded. The chieftain studied him. "Why?" Elias looked toward the mountains. "Because she was wounded." The chieftain remained silent for a long moment. Then he placed a hand against Elias's shoulder. "Tonight, you eat at my fire." That evening, Elias sat among the orcs. For the first time, he saw them differently. They weren't monsters. They were families. Children laughed beside the fire. Mothers prepared food. Hunters repaired tools. Old warriors told stories. Elias noticed something else. There wasn't enough food. The portions were small. Some children received only thin pieces of dried meat. When Elias asked Kayla about it, her expression changed. "We have been struggling for months." "Why?" "The river is dying." She pointed toward the valley. "Our springs are disappearing. The animals have moved away. The crops failed." Elias studied the mountains. "Show me." The next morning, Kayla took Elias beyond the settlement. They followed an old riverbed through the canyon. Elias examined the ground, the plants, and the tracks of animals. After several hours, he stopped. "What is it?" Elias pointed toward a rocky slope. "Water." Kayla frowned. "I don't see any." "That's the point." Elias knelt and pressed his hand against the earth. The soil was damp. He remembered something his father had taught him when he was young. Water often traveled underground through cracks in the mountains. Elias followed the slope upward. Behind a wall of rocks, he discovered a narrow opening. Cold air flowed from inside. He removed several stones. A tiny stream appeared. Kayla stared. "There is water beneath the mountain." Elias nodded. "But we'll need to clear the passage." They returned to the village and told the chieftain. The orcs worked immediately. For 2 days, warriors moved stones while villagers carried tools and buckets. Elias worked beside them. Nobody cared that he was human anymore. He was simply another pair of hands. Finally, on the third morning, the rocks collapsed inward. A powerful stream of clear mountain water burst through the opening. The villagers cheered. Children ran through the water laughing. Kayla looked at Elias with tears in her eyes. "You saved us twice." Elias smiled. "I only found water." "No," she replied. "You gave us hope." From that day forward, the orcs stopped calling Elias human. They began calling him brother of the Red Canyon. But peace was not going to last. Far beyond the mountains, another group was watching the settlement. They had seen the new water source. They had seen Elias. And they had heard about the alliance between the Apache scout and the orc tribe. Their leader smiled. "Let them celebrate," he said. "We'll take the valley when they least expect it." The greatest danger Elias had ever faced was coming. And this time, he wouldn't be fighting alone. For several weeks, peace settled over the Red Canyon. The new spring transformed the orc settlement. Water flowed through the village, crops began growing again, and hunters returned with fresh game. For the first time in months, Children laughed without their parents worrying about hunger. Elias became part of everyday life. He taught young orc hunters how to read tracks and recognize danger signs. In return, the orc warriors taught him how to navigate the narrow mountain passages that only they knew. Even the elders who had once distrusted him began greeting him beside the evening fires. But Elias never stopped watching the horizon. Something about the valley still troubled him. One afternoon, while examining tracks near the northern ridge, he noticed footprints that didn't belong to any orc or human from the settlement. There were dozens of them. Boots. Heavy boots. Elias crouched and examined the ground. The tracks were fresh. Someone had been watching them. He immediately returned to the village. "Kayla," he said, "we have visitors." She looked toward the mountains. "Who?" "I don't know yet." Before they could investigate, a horn sounded from the eastern watchtower. Once. Twice. Then 3 times. The warning signal. Orc warriors rushed toward the cliffs. Elias grabbed his rifle. When he reached the ridge, he saw them. A large band of armed raiders was moving through the valley. There were more than 100. They carried rifles, bows, swords, and torches. At their front rode a cruel-looking man named Varek. He had learned about the orc settlement and its newly discovered spring. He wanted the valley. The land was valuable, and the water source could support a growing army. Varek raised his voice. "Orcs! Leave this valley before sunset." The orc warriors answered with angry cries. Kayla stepped forward. "This is our home." Varek laughed. "Not anymore." He pointed toward the spring. "You have something we need." Elias immediately understood. They weren't there to negotiate. They intended to take everything. The orc chieftain ordered his warriors to prepare for battle. But Elias stopped him. "Wait." The chieftain looked at him. "What? If we fight them here, we lose too many people." The chieftain frowned. "There are 70 warriors ready to fight. And they have more than 100. Kayla looked at Elias. "What do you suggest?" Elias studied the canyon. He noticed the narrow cliffs surrounding the valley. Their numbers are their weakness. He pointed toward the western passage. They can only enter through 3 narrow routes. The orc chieftain understood. "You want to divide them?" Elias nodded. "We don't fight their whole army. We make them fight the mountain." For the next several hours, Elias and the orc warriors prepared. They moved supplies away from the outer homes. They blocked certain trails. They placed hidden archers along the cliffs. Elias taught the warriors where to stand so their arrows could strike the enemy without exposing themselves. Meanwhile, Kayla organized the villagers. Everyone who cannot fight goes into the caves. Children, elders, and families disappeared into the protected tunnels. By sunset, the village looked almost empty. Varek saw the quiet settlement and smiled. "They're afraid." He ordered his men forward. The first group entered the canyon. Nothing happened. Then Elias gave a signal. A single arrow struck the ground beside Varek. The raiders stopped. Another arrow struck. Then another. Suddenly, dozens of orc archers appeared along the cliffs. Varek shouted for his men to advance. They charged. But the narrow canyon turned their large army into a helpless line. Elias fired from behind a rock. One raider fell. The orc warriors released a storm of arrows. The enemy retreated. But Varek was not finished. He pulled a burning torch from his saddle. "If we can't take their homes," he shouted, "we'll burn them." He threw the torch toward the settlement. The fire caught a wooden roof. Flames began spreading. Kayla ran toward the burning building. Elias followed. Together, they fought the flames while the battle continued around them. Then Elias heard a terrible sound. A horn from the western ridge. The raiders had found another entrance. They were coming from behind. Elias looked toward the 70 orc warriors. They were surrounded. The enemy had planned this carefully. Varek smiled from the distant ridge. You thought your little human friend could save you? Elias raised his rifle. He looked at Kayla. Then at the warriors. No, he said quietly. I won't save them alone. He turned toward the 70 orc warriors. They're my people now. And for the first time, Elias charged into battle alongside the warriors who had once been his enemies. The battle erupted before sunrise. The raiders had surrounded the orc settlement from 3 sides, believing their greater numbers would make victory easy. But they had underestimated the narrow canyon and, more importantly, the 70 warriors defending it. Elias stood on a rocky ridge with his rifle in his hands. Below him, orc warriors moved silently through the shadows. Kayla stood beside him, wearing light armor and holding a bow. You should stay here, Elias told her. She shook her head. My people are fighting. So are you. I am their princess. Elias looked at her wounded side. And you're still healing. Kayla smiled faintly. You gave me your horse when I was dying. Don't expect me to hide now. Before Elias could answer, a war horn exploded across the valley. The raiders charged. Hundreds of boots thundered against the frozen ground. Now! Elias shouted. The orc archers released their arrows. A dark wave swept across the sky. The first line of raiders fell back, but their commander pushed them forward. Keep moving. The raiders entered the narrow canyon. That was exactly what Elias wanted. The orc warriors attacked from both sides. They threw spears from the cliffs and fired arrows from hidden positions. The raiders struggled to fight back. Their large numbers became useless. But Varek had anticipated the trap. He ordered a group of raiders to climb the western cliffs. Within minutes, several enemy soldiers reached the top. Elias! Kayla shouted. Elias turned. A raider fired. The bullet struck the rock beside his head. Elias returned fire and dropped the attacker. But more were coming. The orc warriors fought desperately to hold the ridge. One by one, they were pushed backward. Then Varek gave another command. Take the princess. Several raiders rushed toward Kayla. She fired 3 arrows, but her injured side slowed her movements. Elias ran toward her. He knocked one attacker down with the stock of his rifle and fought another with his knife. Kayla grabbed a fallen spear and struck a third. Together, they pushed the attackers back. But then Elias heard a gunshot. He looked down. Blood spread across his shirt. A bullet had struck his shoulder. He staggered. Elias! Kayla caught him before he fell. I'll be fine, he said. You're bleeding. I've been worse. He tried to stand. Another group of raiders surrounded them. Varek stepped forward. You should have stayed out of our business, human. Elias raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking. He was outnumbered. Then something unexpected happened. A roar echoed from the canyon. The 70 orc warriors charged together. They had abandoned their defensive positions. They weren't trying to save the village. They were trying to save Elias. The warriors crashed into the raiders like a storm. Kayla stared in disbelief. Why are they doing this? Elias smiled despite the pain. Because they're my family. The orcs fought their way through the enemy lines. The raiders began retreating. Varek panicked. Fall back. But the canyon had become a trap. The orc warriors surrounded them. Varek escaped with a handful of men, disappearing into the mountains. The remaining raiders dropped their weapons. Silence slowly returned to Red Canyon. The battle was over. The orcs had won. But Elias collapsed. Kayla caught him in her arms. Elias. He tried to speak. Is everyone safe? Kayla looked around. The village was damaged. Several warriors were wounded. But the people were alive. Yes, she whispered. Elias smiled. Good. His eyes closed. For several terrifying moments, Kayla thought he was dead. Then the old orc healer rushed forward. He still breathes. The 70 warriors gathered around Elias. The same warriors who had once arrived at his cabin as strangers now stood silently around him. Their leader lowered his head. He gave us his only horse. Another warrior answered. And today, we gave him our lives. Kayla looked at Elias. She finally understood what had happened. One simple act of kindness had changed two peoples. But there was still one final problem. Varek had escaped. And he would not forget the man who had defeated him. Somewhere beyond the mountains, the defeated raider leader was already planning his return. 3 weeks had passed since the battle at Red Canyon. Snow still covered the mountain peaks, but spring was slowly returning to the valley. Smoke rose peacefully from the orc homes, children played beside the newly restored stream, and hunters returned each evening with food. The village had changed. But Elias had changed too. He sat outside the chieftain's lodge, his injured shoulder wrapped beneath his shirt. The wound was healing, though the old orc healer had warned him not to lift anything heavy for several more weeks. Elias ignored that advice whenever nobody was watching. One morning, he heard footsteps approaching. The orc chieftain appeared with Kayla beside him. Behind them stood the 70 warriors. Elias smiled. What is this? The chieftain pointed toward the valley. Come with us. Elias followed. At the center of the settlement stood a magnificent horse. It was larger than thunder, with a dark mane and powerful legs. Elias stopped. The chieftain handed him the reins. This belongs to you. Elias shook his head. I already have enough. The chieftain smiled. No. He looked toward Thunder, who was grazing nearby. You gave your only horse to save my daughter. He placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. We cannot give you back the same horse. Kayla smiled. So we gave you another. Elias ran his hand along the horse's neck. What is his name? The chieftain answered. Freedom. Elias laughed softly. I like it. Then the 70 warriors stepped forward. Their leader raised his hand. We have another gift. Elias looked confused. The warrior pointed toward a large wooden structure being built beside the village. What is that? Your home. Elias stared. You're building me a cabin. Kayla smiled. Not just a cabin. She pointed toward the valley. Land. A horse. A place at our council fire. And protection from anyone who comes after you. Elias was speechless. For most of his life, he had believed that survival meant standing alone. But these people had shown him something different. Family wasn't always something you were born into. Sometimes family was something you found. The orc chieftain stepped forward. Elias, you arrived here as a stranger. He paused. You leave this ceremony as one of us. The 70 warriors struck their fists against their armor. The sound echoed through the valley. Brother of the Red Canyon. Elias looked around at them. His eyes became wet. He had spent years believing he had nothing left. Now he had a home. He had friends. He had people who would stand beside him. And somewhere in the crowd stood Kayla, smiling at him. Months later, the story of Elias spread beyond Red Canyon. Humans heard how an Apache scout had given his only horse to an injured orc. Orcs told the story differently. They said a human had given kindness when everyone else expected hatred. The two stories eventually became one. A symbol of peace. Trade began between nearby human settlements and the orc tribe. Hunters crossed the old borders without fear. Children from both peoples played together. The old hatred didn't disappear overnight. But it had begun to weaken. And it all started with one wounded woman beside a snowy trail. One man had looked at an enemy and simply seen someone who needed help. Elias never considered himself a hero. Whenever someone asked why he had given away Thunder, he always gave the same answer. She was hurt. That was all. But Kayla remembered something else. One evening, she stood beside him overlooking the valley. "You know," she said, "you thought giving away your only horse meant you had lost everything." Elias smiled. "I remember." She looked toward the village. "But you were wrong." Elias nodded. "I know." Behind them, 70 orc warriors gathered around the fire. Thunder grazed nearby. His new horse stood beside him. And for the first time in many years, Elias didn't feel like a man surviving alone in a dangerous world. He felt like he belonged. A single act of mercy had changed the fate of an entire valley. He gave away his only horse. The next day, 70 warriors came to repay him. And in the end, they gave him something far more valuable than a horse. They gave him a family.